American default, what is it and what to expect? Lawmakers on Capitol Hill have less than a month to avert an unprecedented economic disaster and increase how much money the federal government can borrow or get rid of those caps altogether. If they don't, analysts say Americans could experience anything from a financial crisis and a recession to job losses, higher inflation, and even more expensive borrowing costs. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said in a Monday letter to Congress that the U.S. could be unable to pay its bills by as early as June 1, meaning the federal government is at risk of defaulting for the first time in history. Now, the news comes nearly 3 months after the federal debt reached its $31.1 trillion mandated limit on January 19. Since then, the Treasury Department has been playing the most important game of musical chairs in finance, reshuffling money around through extraordinary measures to keep covering the government's obligations despite being barred from borrowing any more money to fund the government. Now, those efforts include suspending contributions and reinvestment into retirement funds for federal and postal service employees. Once the impasse is resolved, Yellen said the agency would make those funds whole again. Yet the key official's latest letter indicates lawmakers have even less time to reach an agreement than they originally thought. The agency had originally estimated it could buy legislators time through early June, but revised those deadlines amid smaller than expected federal tax receipts. To address the issue, Congress will have to either vote to raise the limit or suspend it altogether. Lawmakers haven't been shy about taking either of those steps before. Since 1960, Congress has adjusted or suspended the stationary debt limit to 78 times, according to the Treasury Department. So, what is the debt ceiling? For centuries, the U.S. has spent more money than it takes in, meaning it runs a budget deficit. Most recently, the deficit hit $1.1 trillion in the first half of the government's fiscal year. That's October through April, according to the Treasury's monthly budget statement. That financing is how the government pays its bondholders, funds its operations, and covers mandatory spending programs from Social Security and Medicare to military salaries, tax refunds, national interest payments, and more. The Treasury Department finances that extra spending by selling government securities. Yet lawmakers don't just hand the agency a blank check. Instead, Congress since 1917 has limited how much the Treasury Department can borrow. That guideline is known as the debt ceiling. So think of it like the credit limit on a credit card. But unlike what happens when you use up your credit line, Congress isn't cut off from spending once it reaches that limit. Lawmakers can and do keep committing to new spending, after which the debt ceiling isn't automatically raised. Addressing the debt ceiling doesn't come with a cost to taxpayer or bring new spending commitments. Rather, it allows the government to continue financing that spending and obligations previous Congresses and President already committed to. Now, both parties have contributed to those massive deficits. Republicans and Democrats approved $3 trillion in deficit finance spending under President Trump in 2020, according to estimate from Mark Zander, chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Democrat-approved American Rescue Plan cost nearly $2 trillion in deficit finance spending, while the Republican-supported tax cuts and job required another $2 trillion. Now, what is happening on Capitol Hill? Political gridlock can make the situation more dire, with legislators often leveraging the deadline to spur concessions. Spearheaded by Speaker Kevin McCarthy, our caliph, the House of Representatives passed a bill on April 26 that would raise the debt ceiling by another $1.5 trillion or suspend that limit through March 31, 2024, whichever comes first. Now, the legislation would also curtail some of the Biden administration's key spending programs, such as the Inflation Reduction Act's energy and climate tax credit expansion and federal student loan forgiveness. Savings would total $4.8 trillion over the next decades, according to the Congressional Budget Office. President Joe Biden also has threatened to veto and oppose the legislation in an April 25 statement, citing a Moody's analysis that it could lead to 780,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2024 and meaningfully increase the likelihood of a recession, the report shows. Biden is planning to meet with McCarthy, Senate Majority Leader Chuck D. New York, and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell for talks on Tuesday. The House passed a reasonable bill that would raise the debt limit, reduce deficit, and slow the growth of our national debt, says Maya McGuinness, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We need to raise the debt limit as soon as possible without drama and without serious risk of default. But Biden is also looking into whether he can constitutionally challenge the debt ceiling by invoking the 14th Amendment, which states that the validity of the public of the United States shall not be questioned, according to a report from the New York Times. Another more extreme action could involve the Treasury Department minting a $1 million platinum coin a step experts says is less likely. So what could it mean for the economy? Well, each day lawmakers don't act could raise the risk. Yellen has said the U.S. defaulting on its debt could cause irreparable harm to the U.S. economy, with borrowing rates on things like credit cards, mortgage rates, and auto loans skyrocketing. Those consequences would add to the challenges the U.S. economy has already been facing before any debt limits slowdown showed up. That is a slowing economy, rising interest rate, and high inflation. The Federal Reserve at its May meeting lifted borrowing costs to the highest level in nearly 16 years. Now, the U.S. has never defaulted on its debt, making the prospect uncharted territory and especially difficult to forecast the impending economic effect. Our SM chief economist Joe Brussela says joblessness could surge anywhere between 7% to higher than 12%, depending on how many bills the government can't pay and how long the government remains in default. Now, Brussela also estimates inflation could surge around 10-11% as the economy claws its way back. Fed officials have so far been mum on commenting about fiscal policy matters, though a default crisis could prompt their involvement to keep financial market from seizing up. If the worst-case scenario of default occurred, Fed officials may be willing to do anything from lending money to banks through its discount window to injecting cash in the short-term market for repurchase agreement to prevent interest rate from soaring, transcript from a 2013 debate review. Now, power sell purchasing securities with delayed payment or even swapping them with non-defaulted treasury would be loathsome, but that he'll be willing to accept it under certain circumstances, the transcript also indicates. Now, the Fed will move in advance of any debt ceiling debacle to reassure financial market participants of the quality of U.S. issue paper, Brussela says, and if necessary, will move to purchase such papers to ensure the functioning of financial markets. Now, Moody's Analytics has previously estimated that default could result in a 2008 style financial crisis, weighing on Americans' livelihood and retirement balances. During previous simulations from 2021, the firm said economic growth could shrink 4% from peak to trough, while 6 million jobs could be at stake. Joblessness could also hit 9%, and household wealth could fall by $15 trillion during a massive stock market decline. The extent of the impact also depends on how the government prioritizes which bills it pays and which ones it doesn't. Lawmakers have indicated they may want the Treasury Department to prioritize paying bondholders before military salaries and retirees. Now, the Treasury Department could also choose to make no payment at all until it has enough money to cover all of its obligations, according to the agency's contingencies plan for a similar debt ceiling impasse in 2011. Now, the Treasury Department makes more than 80 million payments per month, all of which are at risk of not being paid on time. The report also said the federal government would even be at risk of paying its electric bills late. Americans should avoid the temptation to think this is a Washington-only problem, Hamrick said. Now, will the U.S. government default? Well, Congress has certainly cut it close on raising the debt ceiling before, yet experts say the political gridlock has been magnified this time around. It is impossible to quantify, but the risk of default is higher than zero, Hamrick says. The political process is more fractured than in the previous instances, including 2011. This is entirely self-inflicted and avoidable. Economists fear lawmakers might not speed up talks and reach an agreement until they see signs of trouble, such as massive gyrations in the stock and bond market. Investors are already behaving as if there's a risk they might not be paid back. Yields on the one-month Treasury bill, which could mature ahead of the debt ceiling deadline, have surged more than a full percentage point since Yellen's Monday letter. Now, everybody's busy playing politics, but as we get closer to the X date, one hopes that they will put the good of the country ahead of the political games. McGinnis says, now the vast majority of lawmakers know how important this is. They do have an ongoing tendency to only do anything when we bump up against emergency situations. Now, the bottom line is this. Yellen has repeatedly said she supports raising the debt ceiling altogether to remove the risk of default every time the federal government approaches its borrowing ceiling. Americans will want to focus on what they can and cannot control. they can't do much about the gridlock between Washington lawmakers, but they can backstop their finances as much as possible. Focus on building up an emergency savings, even if it means cutting back on discretionary spending to free up some cash. Investors will want to take a long-term mindset and not overreact to short-term events in Washington that hope to be resolved. Now, clearly, not raising the debt ceiling is a bad thing for the economy, but there's a lot of uncertainty if this actually happened of how it's going to unfold. Shana says, some scenarios are worse than others, none are good.